Hello online learners and welcome to the nervous system. So the nervous system in this textbook is chapter 9 and then the brain is in chapter 10. So we're going to look at chapter 9, which is an introduction to the nervous system and neurons and a bit about the spinal cord, and then chapter 10 will be the brain. So once we get started, we'll look at the nervous system is divided and divided and divided again. So the best way to describe it is in this diagram here. So this way you get an idea of the hierarchy of the nervous system. So the nervous system is first divided into two groups: the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves outside the brain and spinal cord. Then the peripheral nervous system is divided again based on voluntary or its skeletal muscles, or its autonomic or non-voluntary route, which is the smooth muscles, the glands, and the cardiac muscles. And these are controlled by what's called the autonomic nervous system, which is again divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So to get an idea of, there is a hierarchy of dividing and dividing and dividing out. So this way it will help you understand all these nervous systems. So let's go back to the beginning again. First off, the nervous system, abbreviated the central nervous system, is the brain and spinal cord, and this is what controls everything. The peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, is composed of the nerves and the ganglia, which are nerve bodies, outside the brain and the spinal cord. Then the peripheral nervous system is broken down into somatic, which controls the skeletal muscles, and automatic, which controls or autonomic, sometimes it says, controls the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and the glands. Then the autonomic system is broken down again to the sympathetic, which is fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which is sometimes seen as rest and digest, because it helps establish the body functions back to normal after the fight or flight situation. So here's the way to break it all down. Now, when we look at nervous tissue is a special type of tissue because it is excitable. And there's two classifications of nervous tissue: the neuron itself, which propagates the stimuli or is the excitable tissue, and then there's a support tissue called the neuroglia. And the neuroglia, you may know of myelin. The neuroglia will support and nourish the tissue. So when you look at the parts of the neuron, here is sort of a basic neuron. You have the dendrites coming in, and they take the information, then they take it to the cell body where it is processed. Then the action potential or the message goes from the cell body out through the axon, and then it hits the terminal buttons or the ends, and then that will stimulate the gland or another neuron, or in this situation, this is the muscle. Okay? So this is just kind of a general motor neuron. And here's another example of neurons. Okay? Now, neurons can have three different types. They can be sensory, which takes information from the sense organs to the brain. So it's input. Then there's output. So once the message is given to the brain, it's interpreted, and then the brain will say, move the arm, say. So that will be motor because it's an output neuron. And then inside the neuron, especially the spinal cord, there's something called an interneuron, which is when the sensory communicates with the motor. And we'll talk about those when we look at the spinal cord. Now, neurons work by the moving of electrical charges, and one of your assignments is to watch a video on the neural impulse and break it down step by step. It's kind of confusing, but it has lots of steps to it. So neurons are excitable because they carry a very small electrical charge. Now, this is about minus 40 millivolts. So if you think of a regular AA battery, that is 1 volt. So a millivolt is 1,000 times a volt. So it's not a very large charge, but it's significant enough to cause a stimulus to move through the neuron. Now, it is there's what's called the resting potential, and the resting potential is due to the setup of sodium-potassium pumps that pump the sodium outside and the potassium inside. Now, you may wonder, how do you get a negative charge when you're moving positives? Three positives are pumped outside for every 2 positives pumped inside. So since there's more positives outside, it's slightly negative, slightly positive, or relatively positive outside. That makes the inside negative. Okay? Kind of confusing. Anyway, when the action potential comes along, the sodium gates open, sodium moves in, and it becomes more positive charged. Then the electrical impulse will move through. Then the potassium gates will open, the potassium moves, and this is what's called an action potential. Now, this is kind of confusing, and you need to know the general how it works, and that's why one of the videos I include is called the neuron impulse, and it breaks it down in a nice little animation because these are moving charges. So whenever you have a process, it's always better to see something moving. The sequence of changes as the electrical signal moves along the axon is called the action potential. And every single neuron has the same action potential, and it's an all or none action potential. In order to get a bigger action potential or a bigger response, you do it by, oops, I went the wrong way, by either getting more neurons or myelinating them. So in order to change the speed of the action potential, you can change the diameter of the axon. The wider it is, the faster it goes. Sort of think of if you have a big wide pipe, a lot of water can go down it quicker than if you have a narrow pipe. Or the amount of myelin. And myelin is this neuroglia that speeds up the action potential, and it speeds it up because it jumps. So if you look at this diagram, just as a frog would jump from lily pad to lily pad and make it faster than, say, swimming all the way through, the impulse will jump from node to node. So the myelinated sheath creates a bit that's wrapped, and then there's a node in between, and the charge will jump from node to node. Now, in the next anatomy class, we'll go into more detail for this, but you basically need to know that an action potential is due to moving charges along the axon. Okay? Now, when we look at problems or some pathology with this, there's a condition called multiple sclerosis. And in multiple sclerosis, the myelination is destroyed, usually by an autoimmune disease, and because that myelin is removed, it will slow down the propagation of the neuron. Another one is Guillain-Barré Syndrome, and again, here you have the myelination destroyed, and you have weakness of the limb, and again, it's because you don't have myelination. Okay. Now, nerves do not touch other nerves. There's a small space, and it's very small, but that space is called a synapse. So the electrical impulse traveling down one neuron changes into a chemical impulse over the synapse, which will then trigger either another nerve or a muscle or a gland. Now, there is a really good video I've included called The Synapse. It's a little detailed, but try and get the general gist of what's happening in terms of all the detail behind it. So when you look at the synapse, up here is the nervous, this is the end of the axon. So then the action potential is coming down. As the action potential comes down, it causes these vesicles. First off, it causes calcium to enter because it opens calcium gates. Then, as the calcium enters, it will change the concentration in the axon terminal, which cause these vesicles containing neurotransmitters to be released or exocytosed from the end of the terminal. These neurotransmitters will then go across this synaptic cleft, which is a space, a very small space, but still a space. And it will bind on the receptor on the following cell. And that will start, and it will open sodium gates and start the impulse there. Again, this is very simplified. Watch the other video because it will help it explain it in enough detail for you to get it, but not too much detail so that you're sort of overwhelmed. Okay? Good. In the chemical synapse, the synapse works by something called neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters are chemicals that go from one axon to the other nerve. And as you can see here in this picture, this is the postsynaptic neuron, or this is the dendrite. So it'll pass its information to the dendrite. Good. What happens here is the impulse travels down the axons. The vesicles are stimulated to release neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters, an example is acetylcholine, will travel across the synapse and bind to a receptor on the postsynaptic cell. And that will cause sodium channels to open, which will then send an impulse down the dendrite or the muscle, whichever it is. Okay? That is sort of a brief summary overall. Now let's look at the spinal cord, or the brain and spinal cord. There are protective coverings around the brain and spinal cord called meninges. And meninges are basically tough connective tissue. So here we have our spinal cord, and then you have these 3 tough layers around the spinal cord. And you don't need to know the name of them, just realize there's 3 of them. And then in among these layers is the cerebrospinal fluid. And cerebrospinal fluid is a special fluid that's produced in the brain, and it circulates around the brain and down the spinal cord. And it helps to cushion and also helps to nourish the central nervous system. And I have another video on the cerebrospinal fluid, which again is very technical, but it gives you the idea of how there are spaces in your brain and around your spinal cord so it can travel down and around. Okay, when you look at the spinal cord, there's white matter, which is the myelination on the outside, and the gray matter, which is where the nervous tissue is. And when you look at the cross-section of a spinal cord, it kind of looks like a butterfly. And again, a lot of information here. You don't need to know that much, just the general white matter on the outside, gray matter on the inside. Okay, and as you go down the spinal cord, it changes depending on what nerves are coming off, but you don't need to know that much detail. Out of each of these spinal processes, so here are all the vertebrae. In between each vertebrae comes out a spinal nerve. And the spinal nerves will then, there's 31 of them, and they send messages to the organs, or they take up messages from the receptors in the other parts of the body. Now, there is a simple way that the body protects itself, and this is by what's called a reflex. And we've all done it. We've all touched something hot and pulled our finger away, and then you say, ow, afterwards. And this is a autonomic reflex because the information doesn't go to your brain. It's fast because it stays at the level of the spinal cord. And this is called a reflex arc. So this is the patella one. The other video I showed you, what happens is there's a stretch receptor in your muscle. So this is the sensor, which will then send a message to the spinal cord. And since it's taking a sensory message to the spinal cord, this is called a sensory neuron. Then in the spinal cord, there's this connecting interneuron, which then passes the message to a motor neuron, which will then cause the muscles to contract. So you have, and that muscle contracting is sort of the effector. So there's some sensor that will send a message directly to the spinal cord, which then sends the action directly from the spinal cord, and this will act on the muscle or whatever it is at the level of a spinal cord, so it is fast, and that is a way of protecting. Okay, and this goes into detail on the patellar reflex. I just want you to know what they are. I don't want to go into much detail. So that is chapter 9. Chapter 10 will be on the brain, will be on a separate video. Good job, my learners.